It is free agency season, yes, in the WNBA. That also means prioritization season is nigh upon us. The great Isabel Rodrigues is here to talk about her in depth piece, what it all means, and where we're going from here. Locked on Women's Basketball starts now.
Ogunbowale for the win.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball.
Well, hi everyone, and welcome to Locked On Women's Basketball. I'm your host, Howard Megdal, thanking you for making us your first listen every day. And a reminder, it's not just me, of course, it is the entire incredible team over at the Nets that brings you Locked On Women's Basketball 6 days a week. You can subscribe for $9 a month, $72 a year to the Nets over at thenextscoops.com. You can check out the work that's being done, the breaking news, the analysis, and then the deep dives. And somebody who does the deep dives as well as anybody in this business is the great Isabel Rodrigues, coming up on her 1 year anniversary soon, being with us at the Next, and wrote an absolutely vital story about prioritization. Isabel, let's just start here for our listeners who may not understand. Define prioritization as it relates to the CBA, the WNBA here in 2023 and beyond.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me today. I'm so excited to talk about this because it's truly like one of the most interesting things I've ever gotten to write about. So prioritization, when it comes to the WNBA, and the 2020 CBA, that is now what's currently governing labor and labor rights in the league, refers to the idea that when a player reaches a certain level of experience, I believe it's like 2 years roughly at this point, although who knows, that might change in the future. But once they hit that level of experience, the league believes that they should prioritize the WNBA and being back on time for the start of the season. And the way that they enforce that, or that they would like to enforce that, is by enforcing some fines, and even in season like full season suspensions if a player of that experience level isn't back to a designated place by their team at a certain time on a certain day. In 2023, that day is like the start of the season, but in 2024, that day will be the start of training camp. So it's going to ramp up over the next 2 years. And the reason this is important is because a lot of times, and we've seen this in the last 2 years especially, there's a significant number of players who are late to the start of training camp. I think Alexa Philippou, who's now at ESPN, did some reporting at the Hartford Courant a couple of years ago that outlined that there was this big chunk of players who were late to training camp and how that affects the dynamic of the WNBA's early season. So there are a lot of coaches who have reflected on like how kind of rough that those first couple of weeks can be, both building team chemistry, team dynamics, especially when a lot of those players, those more experienced players, are your veteran leaders, they're your bench players, they're coming off the bench and supporting those like younger players who are coming into the league. And so the WNBA wants those players to come back to the WNBA on time. But why are they even away from the WNBA in the first place? It's because they don't make enough money for it to be a priority. And so a lot of times those players are coming from overseas leagues that overlap. And so that rule is really getting at the heart of all this.
And so it's vital. I mean, there's a lot to unpack within that. Even beyond training camp, you have routinely seen players, and as long as I've been covering this league, you've seen it, missing regular season games too. People showing up game 2, 3, and 4, and it's not out of a lack of dedication to the craft or anything, just the opposite. I have covered, and I still to this day can't tell if it's like a happy story or an angry story or a sad story. It's the fact that like Kayla McBride will come over routinely from playing overseas and like fly across the world and 24 hours later get on the court. And it's inspirational. Oh my God, it's amazing that she's able to do this. It's dedication. And you can see that too. But it's also like, why is Kayla McBride forced to make this choice? And so the league made this decision. And, to even kind of provide and ground it in a little bit of the context for the listeners as well, this stems out of the 2020 collective bargaining agreement that was signed January 2020, a couple of months before COVID hit. And at that moment, this was discussed, understood. It was part of what Sue Bird talked to me about on the day it was signed. Nneka Ogwumike talked to me about the day it was signed. This is a trade-off. We're going to get increased salaries, and there clearly are increased salaries. Overnight, max went from 119 to 215. You saw veteran minimum go from in the 40s to into the 70s. So there was real money that did change and improve materially what players were able to earn. However, there are a couple of other moving parts to it. One being it's not dollar for dollar. It's not even close to dollar for dollar. And the other part of it is the massive influx of money that we are seeing in women's sports in the 3 years since not being reflected necessarily in the players and what they're able to earn here. So you fast forward 3 years, and there's a couple of parts to this. One being that at the top level, even though there's been this jump, it's not to the extent that a lot of people, including people who negotiated this deal, believe reflect fairly where we ought to be salary wise. And then there's this other part, and this is maybe the bigger part, and this is the heart of the story that you wrote that everyone needs to go check out, which is that combination of increased salaries without an increased salary cap has crushed the middle class of player here in the WNBA. So let's just start with the top line. Are we looking at a top line that you think reflects where the league's economics are right now?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot of room to grow, and I think the next couple of years, especially as we get closer to that media deal that I feel like is looming on the horizon every day, it gets bigger and bigger. As that comes closer, yeah, 2025. Once that kicks in, everything is going to change. So I can't really speculate too far out. But in terms of where the league is right now, the economics really speak to who within the league the WNBA itself prioritizes, for lack of a better word. I mean, we talk about a lot when it comes to league marketing agreements, who is used for promoting the league, where those players are coming from, who they are. A lot of times it is those top earners. It is those people who are making either the max salary or near the max salary. We don't really hear a lot about that middle class of players, especially those veterans who are in the 4 to 5 year experience range at this point. And those are the people that I found through all of this research are going to be the people most impacted, and are in kind of the biggest limbo, so to speak, when it comes to balancing playing in the WNBA, which for a lot of players that I talk to is a lifelong dream that they've had for forever and is the thing they want to be doing, but balancing that with being able to make a steady income off of basketball, which is the thing that they want to make a career out of. And so that balance is becoming increasingly more difficult for them to strike. And especially when you factor in, maybe where a player was coming from originally, whether they come from a background that is particularly wealthy or not, combined with whether they have kids, whether they're married or not. There's a lot of compounding factors that can make a player who's in that middle area all the more difficult than it might already be on its own.
And there's so much institutional knowledge that has been a part of the WNBA story dating back to its earliest days, that when you have this gap between stars and rookies and veterans on the minimum deal, that is necessarily not including a lot of these players who can stick around and be kind of part of that connective tissue of the league's history. I have some worries about that, just purely from a team building perspective. And it gets to what you were talking about, which is, I've been reporting, frankly, I started reporting on the current CBA 2.5 years before it came due. And a lot of those initial conversations with players was does it need to be dollar for dollar? And it doesn't. It doesn't need to be dollar for dollar because
Mm-hmm.
the dream is to play in the WNBA before you even get into the fact that how much you make overseas is in some ways dictated by your level at the WNBA. So I want to talk more in segment two about the particulars, the people who are navigating it, and sort of how we figure out what the next couple of years can look like, what sort of the aspirations are for it. First, I want to talk to the people at home about FanDuel. FanDuel is the official sports book of Locked On. Midway point of the NBA season is here. And so now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's number one sports book. Isabel, I don't know if you had heard about this, but there is a National Basketball Association that was started, has to be recently, and it is for men to play basketball. Were you
Good
familiar
for
with that?
them.
Right. I mean, finally, like, for me, I just think, God, what an opportunity finally for men to occupy the sports space. So, if you go, you can get a no sweat first bet of up to $1,000 at FanDuel. That is bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. You download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. And then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scores and even how many threes people make. Uh, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with the same game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no sweat first bet of up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to fanduel.com/locked on. That's fanduel.com/locked on to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the of the NBA. Here's hoping it's the WNBA soon too.
Fingers
So
crossed.
as we think through some of the specifics, I just want to highlight Kayla Davis, who was central to your narrative in the piece about prioritization. And man, just for the listeners at home to understand, Kayla, if this were the NBA landscape, this is how it would have gone. Because I watched her explode in the 2017 NCAA tournament and
Mm,
absolutely dominate, reach another level. She's a big, versatile wing. She can do a lot of different things on the court at both ends. She comes from, I don't know if people have heard of this program, South Carolina, but it's sort of up and coming, right? And
well,
so,
at the time, yeah. At
well,
the
I
time,
mean, yeah, I
know.
guess, but like even by then, like Dawn had taken them to a Final Four in 2015. They're winning a national championship. I don't know. I'm prepared to say that they were like royalty by 2017, but that's
Okay.
probably a whole other conversation. And so, she's a first round pick and she comes into this lead and establishes herself, but it's challenging because of the
Mm.
rosters. It's challenging for all these host of different reasons. So now we fast forward and here you're speaking to her in the fall and winter of 2022. So where is she 5 years on and how does it compare to where she thought she'd be?
Yeah, I think Kayla was the perfect person to talk to about all of this because she not only did she go through the transfer process in college long before, the transfer portal was a huge thing.
Mm-hmm.
So she had to sit out a season in order to transfer to South Carolina. So
Yeah.
she has that experience of shifting locker rooms. It's like something she's done for a long time. But the idea was that when she got to Dallas, when she was drafted into the WNBA, this is going to be somewhere that she's going to be for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be somewhere where she might have stability. But things don't always work out the way that you might seem, and I think part of the both the rosters that you mentioned, it's really, really, really hard to make a WNBA roster. It might still be the hardest roster to make in women's sports at this point. But
Mm-hmm.
because of that, because of the way that league positions are shifting, um, and because of the trajectory of her career, she ends up coming off the bench more and slowly over time becomes relegated to more and more limited minutes.
Yeah.
And then, in the 2022 season becomes more of a hardship, like journeywoman player. She starts filling in on different rosters. She played in 3 different cities during the 2022 season. ended up in Phoenix, where she had kind of a miracle late run in the playoffs to help them basically finish that out on the last leg, literally because she was coming in for Shea Petty. And she really made a kind of a final statement despite being in one of the weirdest positions that she'd been in for throughout her basketball career. I mean, changing 3 locker rooms in one season, which is, you know, only 3 months, is one of the more difficult things that you can do in the league. And so by the time that I was speaking to her,
I just want to point out what that journey that you're outlining here is not singular, right? It's not singular. This stat you had, and you had a ton of just like eye-catching stats. But from 2019 to 2022, the number of players on a standard full season contract dropped by nearly 26%. And you see a lot of these people, instead of having stability, even within the confines of a WNBA season, they're just like traveling barnstormers, essentially.
Absolutely. Yeah,
And
and a lot of that comes
not only
from the salary cap situation that we talked about. Obviously, players, when, you know, the owners want to pay their top players as much as they possibly can, and that makes a lot of sense, and I'll never say that they shouldn't be doing that,
no doubt, no
because, you
doubt
know, we
about
raise the max salary for a reason.
it. I
But
mean,
when
I
the
I've heard players can make up to $700,000. Can you tell me some of the players who have?
we could talk about the $700,000. Oh
Fair
boy.
enough. Yeah, that's a
But
whole.
when the but when the salary cap itself does not increase alongside of these increasing max salaries and minimum salaries, all of a sudden you have a situation where, in order to pay your max players more, you're sacrificing the bulk of your roster, in terms of these like middle tier players who are making the vet minimums. A lot of times they end up getting replaced by rookie players because their salaries are just that much less that it ends up fitting into the roster. And then all of a sudden you have this influx of players who either started on one team and then get cut or waived early on in the season and just bounce around on these hardship contracts where they're making like thousands of dollars singular to play a couple of games here and there, and then they expire, and maybe they get picked up somewhere else, maybe they don't. And it's like the most uncertain place that you can be, both from a financial standpoint, because you don't know how much you're actually going to make until you finish the end of your contract.
Right.
From a healthcare standpoint, because as soon as you're waived or cut, that's gone as well. And then also, just in terms of an emotional standpoint, a housing standpoint, being close to your family, like all of these different things compound when you're in this situation of having to move from place to place.
It,
And yeah.
it's just so notable to me that something, and I don't think there's so much blame here to go around between the W and the Players Association. It's a new system. There are always unintended consequences when you push and pull.
Absolutely.
It's so complicated. But what's fascinating to me is a thing that was designed in large part to try and make it more secure as a means of making a living to play professional basketball here in the United States has made it hard for a significant number of the very people you want most to be doing this beyond the star of stars, in a way that I think having negative ramifications, not just for the players, but for the teams as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that chemistry building that we talked about at the beginning, where it's so difficult at the start of the season when you don't have your key players there, you know, they're missing games here and there. Maybe they missed training camp because they're still coming over. That's being exported into the actual season itself, because all of a sudden, like, you're bringing in new people all the time. And it's not to say that like signing people mid-season is an uncommon thing. It happens all the time.
No
But
doubt.
when you're changing out and rotating through your like veteran bench players on a regular basis, and you're bringing in new faces all the time, you know, new players on 7-day contracts, like all of this stuff, it affects the dynamic of a team. It really does.
The difference between the 11th or 12th player and it being somebody who is part of your rotation, a critical part of your rotation. God knows how many conversations I've had with GMs over the past few years where you say, this is a player we are relying on. And now we got to get her through waivers in the middle of the season as a salary cap trick because it's a hard cap, because it's a cap that is unforgiving in all of these different ways. It just strikes me, from a competition standpoint alone, figuring ways to ease that would make a lot of sense in a proactive way. So before I let you go, I want to talk about, as always, we never get to everything we want to talk about. So we gotta have you back here again really soon. But I just the specifics of like between now and 2025, which now, unfortunately, because expansion's been pushed back, there's not even that revenue stream coming in. We get into the issues of waiting for a media rights deal now for several years. And so, given all of that, what from the players you spoke to is sort of the number one hope and dream of how we fixed short term this issue of turnover among some of the vital members of this league?
Yeah, I think there are two main things that stuck out to me, both from the players I talked to and just reviewing the data and looking at where we are right now. The first thing is really that hard salary cap, and figuring out like whether it's a flexible cap or just getting like rid of it entirely, like trying to be more flexible with how we pay players and thinking about cash infusions. Like the PHF just had one more recently, where we can support players in the short term, and accept like a short term solution before we build up to the next CBA. And the CBA opt out date is going to be another big timeline kind of data point to look at in the future, because it'll be right after prioritization, but just before the media deal, I believe. So it's kind of in that weird limbo spot of when the players will have the option to opt out of this current CBA and start working on a new one. And from players I spoke to, like that's already like starting to come to mind is opting out of this current one. So that will certainly be something to think about. Is what to do about salaries.
It's really going to be fascinating, and
Right.
I'm really eager to see how that conversation evolves over this time. Because again, even just to take it back full circle, back in 2020, this was understood, I think, on both sides as a risk. And so now we're here, and we're about a year out. It's fascinating to me, incidentally, that we've seen very few players not re-signing because of prioritization this year. So then the question is, okay, so they are going to face the same issue next year. How does it work? Notice Brianna Stewart signs a 1-year contract. It's coming. It's coming.
It is. It really is. And I think that the influx of 1-year contracts has been really interesting, especially the folks who have chosen to pick up multi-year deals have been even more interesting. And why they're choosing to do that, and talking to those players in the coming weeks is going to be really fascinating. But yeah, so that's like the first kind of big thing. And then the second thing is just figuring out their relationship with FIBA and these domestic leagues overseas. Is how, because at least from what Jackie Powell and I have done a lot of research about and have talked about extensively over time, the WNBA thinks that it's done a lot in terms of accommodating FIBA, and they've been very open about that. And FIBA believes that they've been very accommodating of the WNBA, and they've been very open about that. And so it's kind of coming to an arms race at this point of who is going to be able to amass as many players as possible. And it's going to have to be something that we figure out, because the schedules are just impossible. I mean, we heard a lot about it at the World Cup this year because it happened at the time that it did. But the schedule that some of these players are working on right now is absolutely ridiculous when you take a step back and look at it. I mean, I just encourage everybody to just go look at how and where Alyssa Thomas has been playing since she came off of that Achilles injury. Just go take a look at it. And then I think that will give you a clear picture of what some players have been doing for years before this point.
And the league footprint is getting bigger, not smaller. The league is up 40 games this year. That's not going away. The league, as it intends to negotiate a new media rights deal, needs more inventory, not less. It's absolutely fascinating. I love that you're on top of it for us. Anyone who is not following Isabel, ISABELBARROSO78 on
That's
Twitter,
me.
as long as Twitter exists. If you're not seeing that on your YouTube version of our podcast, make sure you follow Isabel. I followed her a little under a year ago and knew immediately that she had to come join us at the next. And I am delighted every day since she was here with us. Thank
I've made.
and thank you to all our listeners for listening to Locked On Women's Basketball and making it your first listen today. Now make your second listen, Game to Game NBA. Every moment, every top performance, every result from that league I was telling you about earlier, Isabel. Locked On Game to Game NBA covers every game from across the NBA with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. Follow Game to Game on Locked On NBA, available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, or wherever you get podcasts. There are two other teams that are probably not as likely to bring a championship to New York as the New York Liberty, but they're the Knicks. Is it? Is a K is silent, right?
Yeah, something about that word haunts my every waking nightmare.
The
So,
Knicks, and then the Nets, who
okay.
but the Nets, actually, to be fair, they have a super team with Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving and James Harden. They're all. I'm sorry, I'm getting word that none of them are still there. So the super team in Brooklyn.
They decided that the team named after a piece of equipment was maybe not the most fun place to be.
And not even like the piece of equipment that people liked the most. Not even like if you were like the top 5, it wouldn't. Well, all right. So anyway, we'll talk more about prioritization and the basketball net as a noun and an entity another time. Isabel Rodrigues, thank you for your time. To our listeners, thank you for being with us. Please join us tomorrow, where the great Natalie Hevrin will have you covered. And then on Saturday, Hunter Cruz will take you through everything you need to know about the WNBA draft. So until then, I am Howard Megdal, wishing you all a wonderful Thursday.
Ogunbowale for the win.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball.